Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you all are doing well today. And to all my new supporters joining us for the first time, welcome to the family. Today, I will be reacting to what if Canada joined the European Union. Now, you guys know I have been suggesting this for the longest amount of time now. So now, today, we will be finally checking out this wonderful video, which you guys have actually recommended. Thank you so much. Here we go. Let's jump right into it.
If Canada joined the European Union, it would immediately become the fifth largest member by population. 39 million. Currently, Germany is the EU member with the most people, 84 million, about double Canada's population. France is currently the largest by area, 540,000 square kilometers or 210,000 square miles. If Canada joined, it would be far and away the largest EU country by area, roughly 10 million square kilometers or 3.8 million square miles. In fact, Canada is over double the size of the current European Union, meaning that adding Canada as 28th member would triple the geographic area of the European Union. But come on, Canada is not on the European continent, so how in the world could it be part of the European Union? The so-called Copenhagen criteria for EU enlargement has other prerequisites to joining the EU, such as democratic institutions, rule of law, a functioning market economy, the willingness and ability to comply with EU law. You'll notice being on the European continent is not a formal requirement to join. Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU says being a, quote, European state is a requirement, but the term European state is left undefined. Part of the process of negotiating accession is determining if a state is sufficiently European. So might Canada qualify in a stretched definition of a European state based on heritage and its head of state? We'll get back to that. But let's not just pass over the raw geography here, because yeah, most of the EU's countries are indeed on the continent and share a land border. Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta are EU members that don't share a land border with another EU country, but nonetheless, their relative proximity allows ease of trade and movement of people. If, just for the sake of argument, New Zealand were to consider joining the European Union, the challenge of being so very far away would surely complicate that conversation, even if we consider New Zealand's European links. And that's especially true due to the geographic nature of defense policy, which we'll get to. One way to overcome the geographic issue for Canada is to simply turn the globe and realize that Canada isn't that far away. Cape Columbia, Canada's northernmost point, is only 2,400 kilometers away from Norgum, Finland, 1,500-ish miles. That's half the distance between New York and California. The distance between St. John's, Canada and Dublin is about the same as between Dublin and Cyprus. You can fly from Helsinki, Finland to Lisbon, Portugal within the EU in about 4.5 hours. And similarly, you can go from Montreal to Lisbon in 6.5 hours. It's different, but nothing crazy. Between Canada and the European Union are also Iceland, Greenland, the United Kingdom, Norway. While not EU member states, they are all closely linked to the EU. Take all these places in EU orbit and add Canada, and it starts to look like a genuinely formidable bloc. With a tripled territory, there would be a lot more land and sea to defend. On the other hand, the EU and Canada would become unified players in the Arctic at a crucial moment. So that's one piece here. Canada joining the EU is a bit of a stretch geographically, but let's return to the more challenging direct question. Could Canada qualify under Article 49 as a European state? Canada is right above the United States, and it feels like it. Canadian English and American English are hard to distinguish, and a lot of Canadian culture is based on finding ways to distinguish from America because the similarities can be so overwhelming. So yeah, at first glance, Canada joining the EU is about as odd as the United States joining the EU. Oceans and cultures divide, but Canada is a country with European roots, Western European to be specific. Now, I don't want to step into a big debate about colonialism, but suffice it to say that the British and French empires left their marks on Canada in ways that remain culturally and politically relevant, arguably more relevant than the legacy of those empires in the United States. And
somebody in the comments a few weeks ago said, well, under that video I reacted to a long time ago, I forgot which video it actually was, but somebody had actually mentioned, how come Quebec doesn't just join the European Union? Quebec's connected to Canada. I feel like if Quebec is going to join the European Union, then Canada as a whole should be united with the European Union. It makes more sense, especially considering that, they're having a little trouble reaching their GDP, their military GDP, that 2% that they need. I've always been saying that, Canada joining the European Union is much needed. They might as well. And I was aware that they weren't next to each other, but only 4 hours away and then 6 hours away, that's not bad at all. That's close enough. Come on now. That is very close.
politically relevant, arguably more relevant than the legacy of those empires in the United States. And thus, Canada is a country that could plausibly join the EU and fit right in culturally. In Quebec, people tend to identify as Canadian, but also as a distinct Quebecois with deep French ties. If you were dropped in Quebec City or Montreal, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were in Europe. And French is one of the official languages of Canada, required for civil servants.
Wait, I thought, oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back a little bit too. I thought the people in Quebec didn't see themselves as Canadians. They didn't call themselves Canadians because it's a complete different culture. Everything is different about Quebec versus Canada. The culture, the language, the foods, everything. Even a few videos back, it mentioned that people in Quebec don't see themselves as Canadians. But ever since this whole tariff situation started, Quebec and Canada have been feeling, unity towards each other. They've been feeling unity and making themselves a whole rather than separating, based on tradition or language, foods, culture. Yeah. So I'm kind of confused as to, do all people from Quebec identify as Canadian or not? Because I've learned that people in Quebec do not count themselves as Canadians. And they feel that there's actually a divide between the two, Quebec and Canada.
Deep French ties. If you were dropped in Quebec City or Montreal, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were in Europe. And French is one of the official languages of Canada, required for civil servants. French, by the way, is one of the two most prominent languages in the EU's bureaucracy. The other is English. Of course, most Canadians speak English thanks to British colonialism. It's not just cultural, it's also political. Over the years, most of Canada has proudly demanded to keep the British monarch as head of state, even when becoming a dominion in the late 1800s. Contrast that with the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, where the main sticking point for Irish Republicans was revulsion at keeping the King of England as their head of state. It caused the Irish Civil War. Canada hasn't been like that. The Governor General still represents the British monarch's interests in Canada, albeit ceremonially, and Canada has a parliament and prime minister, modeled off the Westminster system. Now, these two European components, French Canada and Anglo Canada, don't always see eye to eye. For example, French Canada was not universally enthused when Canada joined World Wars I and II alongside the UK, but still, Canada joined World Wars I and II long before the United States because of their deep ties to the UK and Europe. In fact, in World War I, Canada was automatically joined in the war when the UK declared. To hit home this point, I asked my friend Elise for a little help. I met her when I was working at the German embassy, and she was a French diplomat here in DC. Her thesis was coincidentally about Canada and the Great Wars in Europe.
So my question to you is, admitting that it is a bit of a stretch, because of Canada's roots in the British and French Empire, because of the way they participated in World War I and II, is there an argument to be made that Canada is more European than it first appears?
Well, it does have a more connected history to Europe that America can have, because America somehow, like in his identity, national building story is all about breaking the chains with Europe, where Canadians until very recently, and I think still nowadays, if you have a visit of the royals, there's a strong feeling. Actually, on the coins in Canada, you can still have the Queen and some of the symbolism. So there is a strong history with that. Now, Canada has only one border, and that's still a pretty big difference with any European country. But I like your comparison, and I think in many ways Canada could be the Switzerland of North America.
So the bottom line,
I like how she put
history,
that.
for culture, for blood, Canada isn't as far from a European state as you'd initially think. Sure, it's a stretch, but there's a lot of subtlety here, and those deciding an application would get to engage with that subtlety because this would be legally unprecedented. I mentioned the UK several times. You probably already have thought, well, the UK left the European Union, so doesn't that cancel out one of Canada's European ties? To that I say, meh. The bottom line is that despite the fact that Canada joining the EU seems at first to be quite random, It's not, as we've seen, neither geographically nor culturally. But now things get even more complicated. Canada potentially joining the EU cannot be truly understood without addressing the sticky issue of defense.
Here we go. I just mentioned that
There's
too.
broad overlap between members of the European Union and members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defense alliance founded in 1949 and traditionally led by the United States. In fact, 23 of the EU's 27 member states are also in NATO. But of course, NATO and the European Union are not the same thing. There are members of the EU that are not NATO, and there are members of NATO that are not in the EU. For example, Canada is in NATO, but not in the EU.
Right.
So what would it mean for Canada to join the European Union now as a pre-existing member of NATO? Well, nothing. Sort of. Defense treaties as they exist today aren't the problem. Canada is in NATO, as are many European member states. If Canada joined the European Union, it would simply be another member in both institutions. The complication comes from growing US skepticism of the NATO alliance. What if the US formally leaves the NATO alliance? Or even, as things stand, what if a NATO country is attacked and the commander-in-chief of the United States orders the military to ignore any invocation of Article 5 for mutual defense? Because President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the Secretary of Defense have left lots of open questions in the room about the US fulfilling its treaty obligations, the EU has recently voted to empower member states to spend additional hundreds of billions on their own defense. Large European countries like Germany and France no longer only speak about meeting 2% of GDP for defense spending, as is expected for NATO, but as the head of NATO put it, considerably more than 3%, which some countries like Poland are already exceeding. It leads to a larger question for the European Union, one that I remember being battered around during my time at an EU member embassy here in Washington. Given the unprecedented threats from Russia and mixed messages from Trump, should the EU have its own military? Not just the German military or the Dutch military or the Estonian military, but a single entity controlled by Brussels.
I've been
French
saying that for a
President
while.
Emmanuel Macron called for such a true European army back in 2018 and has recently floated the idea of extending France's nuclear deterrent to its European allies. Which brings us to Canada. If Canada were to join the EU, it would need to make a judgment call about the direction European defense is headed. If the EU maneuvers towards a joint defense strategy or joint defense forces, Canada would presumably be part. Might some of Canada's armed forces one day be under the umbrella of Brussels? And how does Canada feel about that? Admittedly, it's speculation on speculation, but decisions would need to be made. In exchange for being part of European defense, Canada would receive the same, which until recently sounded far-fetched and unnecessary, but President Trump said in February 2025 that he wasn't happy with the US-Canadian treaty on borders. And of course, he's constantly insisted that Canada should become the 51st state. Nearly impossible to distinguish bloviating and trolling from legitimate threats, but here we are. So when I was writing the script, I had a hard time determining if these defense questions were trickier than the economic questions. But as of writing, these defense issues are mostly speculative. Meanwhile, the most complicated piece of the puzzle is the very real trade war playing out between the US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. The US trade war and renegotiations of USMCA are the most pressing reasons Canada may consider the heretofore unconsidered idea of joining the European Union. If the economic relationship enjoyed between the US and Canada hits the rocks any harder, Canada will likely want new deals with reliable trading partners. The same goes in reverse for the European Union, as news of American tariffs move faster than headlines can keep up. Of course, if Canada were to join the EU, it would bring its $2.2 trillion economy with it, and by joining it would become the fourth largest economy by gross domestic product. The EU as a bloc is already Canada's third largest trading partner. Bring Canada into the European Union, make them part of the single market for goods and services, exchange free movement of people, the EU may soon rank even higher. There's a lot of assumptions there. First, that Canada joining the EU wouldn't affect trade with the UK, another large Canadian trading partner, which has, of course, left the EU. Second, because beginning accession negotiations to the European Union requires unanimous support from all 27 member states, Canada would need to hope none of its exports were threatening to domestic European firms that could then lean on their home governments to block Canada's accession. For example, a 2017 free trade agreement between Canada and the EU has yet to be fully implemented all these years later because 10 EU countries refused to ratify it. The entire EU would have to be serious about having Canada. But these economic details seem minor compared to this. As of now, about 77% of Canadian exports head to the United States. The Canadian government calls it, quote, the most extensive trading relationship. We are each other's largest trading partners. Canada and the US are part of USMCA, formerly NAFTA, a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Even if the Trump administration unilaterally sabotages the USMCA with tariffs, it would still be incredibly difficult for Canada to replace the volume of its free trade from the United States to Europe. Nonetheless, EU and Canadian officials have pledged to have each other's backs as Trump's trade war intensifies. And Canada has aimed to increase its non-US exports by 50%, according to Reuters, and a lot of that would be the European Union. In the meantime, there are initial murmurs of a European movement in Canada, and writers from the BBC and CBC and Economist have indulged the idea, like I'm now doing. Europe needs space and resources, read an Economist headline. Canada needs people. Let's deal. Some minor officials chimed in to endorse the conversation, and Germany's prominent former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, said that the EU should indeed invite Canada to join. When news of that poll I mentioned, showing 44% of respondents thought Canada should join the EU, a European Commission spokesperson said the EU was honored, though she said she wouldn't comment further. On that note, is Canada joining the EU realistic or just wild speculation? I thought about that a lot, and part of the reason I decided to go ahead and write this is because the realm of possibilities has expanded in recent months. The world is realigning, and fast. Something unthinkable. Canada joining the EU, perhaps literally not even having been conceived until recently. It's now out there as something people are talking about. That said, realignment with Europe is more likely than literally joining. It's not likely, at least not a formal joining of Canada becoming the 28th member of the European Union. But what is more realistic,
That's right, the 28th member of the European Union, not the 51st state of the United States of America.
Becoming the 28th member of the European Union. But what is more realistic, almost guaranteed by the behavior of the United States, is closer alignment between Canada and the EU. Depending on how much the trade war and other disputes escalate, perhaps a partnership of a depth impossible in other circumstances.
Yeah, the more this whole tariff situation continues, the more Canada will push towards joining the European Union. I was going to say before they even pulled up the poll chart, let's run a vote. Come on, let's run a vote and let's include the citizens within the European Union and Canada as well and see what the people think. Come on now. But you guys let me know in the comments down below what you think about this. How do you feel about Canada joining the European Union? Of course, that is going to affect trading with the US, but haven't we already ruined that? Haven't we already affected that? Come on now. Both countries are losing a tremendous amount of money, so the most Canada could do right now in their power is to move on. Join the European Union and move on. That's how I feel, honestly. Everybody, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and turn all post notifications on. Feel free to share this video and channel to your friends and family members. And please continue to flood my comment section and suggestion link in the description down below if you would like to recommend some more of these educational videos for me to check out on a daily basis. Once again, everybody, feel free to share your personal thoughts on this idea down below in the comment section. Be honest as well. You know, I'm up to read all comments like always. Everyone stay safe, and I hope to catch you all in the next reaction video.